December 14th, 1861. A loving couple is separated by death. Unexpectedly dying at just 42 years old, a husband leaves behind a grief-stricken wife and 9 children. Today, a funeral would have occurred within a week. Flowers laid on the grave for a few days to follow, comforting cards and an overflow of visitors. But within a month, the family would have to continue on with their day-to-day lives. While grief may take years to get over, the mourning process of today's society is quick and unforgiving. While this man's wife mourned till the day she died. This man's widow was no ordinary wife. She was Queen Victoria, and when her husband, Prince Albert, died of tuberculosis, she wore black the remaining 40 years of her reign. Being the most famous monarch known to Europe and America, what the Queen made her obsession became the people's everyday life. When Queen Victoria went into everlasting lamentation, society followed suit, and thus began the extraordinary frenzy of the peculiar practices of Victorian mourning. The popular concept of cleanliness is next to godliness was one of the most unpracticed concepts in the Victorian era. Germs and bacteria were considered non-existent until their discovery in the 1880s, leaving the whole of the Civil War with surgeons who didn't wash their hands, thousands dying of dysentery, and people rarely taking a bath. Infant mortality rates were constantly high, it seemed, with almost every nuclear family losing at least one child, no matter the social class. Phrases today like throwing the baby out with the bathwater had a more alarming meaning for infants during the 1800s than it does today. Drawing baths was a strenuous activity in the Victorian era, when it was done, and the same water used first from the oldest person in the household would be the same water the youngest would use last, making the water so murky, a mother should not forget her child is still in the water when she throws it out. Needless to say, infant and adolescent death was a common thing within the 19th century. This kept society very involved with mourning practices, with many households in a community going through the mourning process several times throughout the years. As photography became more widespread among people of all classes, families began having their picture taken, while alive and dead. Though this is a taboo practice in modern society, it was not uncommon for a family to have an entire book filled with family members that were photographed dead. Today, we wish to remember our loved ones as they were when they were alive, as people in the Victorian era did also. However, postmodern pictures were often taken not because the family wished to see their loved ones deceased, but because it might be the only picture they ever have of them. Postmodern photography of children was especially popular. As many children died in and before adolescence, the photographs could be given out to family members in remembrance. Though most postmodern pictures featured the dead in a coffin, many photographs are eerie to look at, as the corpses can be perceived to be alive. Many times it would take days for a photographer to reach people's households, leaving some bodies to be photographed days after their death. Some photos feature corpses doing lifelike things, like reading or sitting with family members. Though these pictures are disturbing to many today, they were fond reminders to mourning Victorian families, who didn't have the convenience of digital cameras or camcorders, to record the memories of their loved ones. The mourning process began almost immediately after death. Unlike today, funeral parlors and separate locations for funerals were unheard of. It was tradition that all preparations for the body and visitations were done inside the home. where the body could be looked after by family members. Sometimes bodies were held in the home for more than a week, as traveling family members took longer than they would today to arrive for funerals. The body would have been prepared in the kitchen of a home, where it was not uncommon for servants of upper-class families to continue cooking or cleaning for a family, while the body lay out. As some children were known to be looked after in the kitchen, children were more adapted to seeing corpses and being near the dead than they are today. The body was never alone before the burial. As medical science was not as advanced as it is in modern times, a dead person was always watched, as they could be known to come alive after several days, today being known as coming out of a coma. People also feared for their loved ones being buried alive. Some coffins were equipped with a bell system, where the dead were buried holding a rope, in which they could pull that rang a bell above ground, alerting the living that they were awake and indeed alive. Though not proven, many believe phrases such as "for whom the bell tolls" and "saved by the bell" could have come not just from the ringing of church bells to signify a death, but in the small bells positioned near graves, where the soft sound of clinking and ringing could literally save someone's life. When the American Civil War erupted in 1861, thousands of men enlisted into the Union and Confederate armies, leaving thousands of wives, children, and family members alone to fend for themselves. Many women spent months waiting for their husbands and sweethearts to return, and more often than not, they either returned home wounded or not at all. As the women waited for their soldiers, they shed tears in lacrimatories, or tear bottles, which they would fill up with tears until their sweethearts once again returned to them, in which they could show their soldiers how much they had been missed. Lacrimatories were unfortunately used during the mourning period also, with loved ones using the tear bottles to time their mourning periods, in which when the bottle was full, the mourning period would end. Once a loved one died, the stages of mourning were more complicated for women. In this 19th century monogamous society, men who experienced a loss wore black bands around their arms and went about their day-to-day business, while women were expected to remain in mourning for at least up to a year, and in several places it was extended to 2 years. Depending on the family member would depend on how long she mourned, and at what stage. There were 2 stages of mourning, deep or full mourning and half mourning. The mourning process for a widow was the most difficult. It was more of a kind of rite of passage than anything else in a woman's mourning experience. The first stage of mourning was considered a separation period for the widow. She was expected to wear all black, remove herself from society, and not even attend the funeral or burial of her husband because of the intense isolation she was expected to perform. For the first month during her transition, she could not leave her home, and only by the second could visitors begin to call on her. By the 3rd month, she finally would make her incorporation back into society, but it was required that she wear black and not participate in any festivities. When the period of half-mourning came about, she could begin to wear colors other than black, but only if they were gray or of neutral dark color tones. Every bit of her clothes were expected to be black, from her undergarments to her handkerchiefs, her jewelry, and even the small pins she stuck in her hair. Women of lower-class families often had to dye a dress black, as there was no way she could not appear in mourning. Shops were never out of stock for ready-made mourning gowns, and all mourning merchandise sold well. Jewelry was required to be jet black until after full mourning had finished, and then some designs and often even jewelry with pictures on them were allowed to be worn. Making jewelry out of the deceased hair was also popular, as well as many hair wreaths of family members who had passed away. The mourning period for children, in-laws, and husbands was somewhat different. A child or parent would mourn the loss of the other around 9 months, and extended families such as aunts, uncles, and in-laws would be mourned anywhere from a couple of months to a few weeks. While husbands had to have a short time to mourn their wives, it was encouraged that a man with small children marry as soon as possible to replace a mother for his children. The obsession with mourning a loved one was so required that often low-class families would begin saving up for a death, because of how high the war and child mortality rates had affected a constantly mourning society. While people in the Victorian era were predominantly Christian in their beliefs, that didn't stop them from being wildly superstitious about the supernatural. Though many of the mourning rituals served as a rite of intensification to bring people together and pay tribute to the dead, many superstitions kept the family members afraid of their loved ones in death. Pains were taken to make sure that all curtains were drawn, all mirrors covered, and that black wreaths covered the entry doors so that all would know a death had occurred. Mirrors were covered to ensure that the soul of the deceased did not get trapped in the looking glass. Family photographs were also covered or turned down, from preventing the living from being possessed by the deceased in the picture. The dead were carried out of the house feet first, in order for the deceased not to look back upon the house, and beckon another family member to follow him or her to the grave. The living were also obsessed with contagious magic. They believed that often items of the dead would aid the spirit in coming back and haunting the family, and that anything of the living left with the dead would be certain to make the spirit return to get you. The idea of throwing salt over your shoulder was a superstition of the Victorian era. If you spilt salt, you had to throw a pinch of it over your shoulder to prevent death from coming your way. There was a superstition for almost every death ritual performed during mourning, keeping people not only mourning the loss of the dead, but their spirituality always making them afraid they will be the next to die. The use of embalming became popular during the Civil War, as men's body of high ranking or wealth was in need of preserving so they could be sent home to be buried. Once the use of embalming became the norm, preserving fluids were often sold off the shelves of general stores, so families could preserve their loved ones. Oftentimes that did not guarantee that the smell of the body would not fill a household, so an overabundance of flowers were needed in order to mask the smell, as the body lay out for several days during visitation. Death rituals and mourning the deceased was nothing new in the Victorian era, just a diffusion of practices that had been used from societies like the ancient Egyptians, Romans, and all the way to the medieval ages with practices of their own to mourn the dead. People of the Victorian era were the last period in history to have so many mourning practices and rituals that affected their day-to-day lives. Today, anthropologists can study the secondary innovation of mourning rituals of the Victorian era, to see why so many of the practices still go on today. Though our worldview of dying and mourning the deceased is different than in those times, things like wearing black to a funeral, bringing flowers, and embalming the dead are still going strong today. Perhaps a study of Victorian mourning can answer why families spend so much on funerals, hundreds of millions of dollars every year throughout America, to ensure a loved one has a non-decomposable coffin and preserving fluids, in order to simply be placed in the ground. In no part of the world except for North America is this practice so widely used. So why were our ancestors so obsessed with mourning? The real reason perhaps we will never know. At least we can be aware of where our customs came from, and know that whether death is perceived in the way Victorians made it an everyday part of life, or over in a few days in modern times, death is something we all must learn to live with, as no one is escaping it.